It was supposed to be just another boring night shift at Walmart. I, Mark, 27, had been working there for about 2 years, and by this point, the monotonous hours barely fazed me. The only thing that kept me going was the paycheck and the fact that the store was almost empty after 10 p.m. Not many people dared to shop at night, especially in that part of town. The air in the store always felt colder after hours. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed too much of the day's activity and were now resting in an eerie silence. There was no music playing, just the soft hum of the overhead lights and the occasional click of a door or the shuffling of a customer's shoes across the linoleum floors. That night, I was assigned to the electronics section. Not exactly exciting, but at least I didn't have to deal with restocking or angry customers. The area was pretty far from the front doors, tucked in a corner of the building where the faint sound of the highway could barely reach. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Around midnight, I was rearranging some DVDs on the shelf when I noticed something odd. One of the security cameras in the corner of the aisle was flickering. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but then it went dark altogether. I paused, frowning, and glanced around the store. Everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could get after hours. But then I heard it. A soft tapping sound, like someone was knocking on the glass doors of the electronics section. I figured it was probably a customer who had gotten locked out and needed to be let in, but when I approached the door to check, no one was there. It was as if the tapping had never happened. My heart rate picked up a little. I looked around the section, no one in sight. But then, as I turned back to the shelves, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the security monitor, the camera feed was back on. But instead of the usual view of the aisle, it was showing something strange. There was a figure standing at the far end of the aisle, just out of sight. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could tell it was tall, unnaturally tall. I froze, staring at the monitor. It wasn't a customer. I had been working long enough to know the regulars, and no one who came in this late would be dressed like that. They were wearing an old, ragged hoodie like something you'd find in a thrift store, but the sleeves were too long, covering their hands. I watched, holding my breath. Then the figure took a step forward, and the camera feed went black again. I stood frozen, staring at the darkened security monitor. The flicker of static was all that remained of the figure that had appeared just seconds ago. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen or thought I had seen. It could have been a trick of the light, a malfunction with the camera, or my own tired eyes playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was off. I took a deep breath and walked over to the camera, hoping to fix whatever glitch had caused it to go black. But as I reached the monitor, the tapping noise returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, coming from behind me. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, scanning the aisle behind me. The rows of electronics were dimly lit, casting long shadows on the floor. The store was deserted, no one around. Yet, the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing second. It was as if someone was tapping their fingernails on the back of a display case, just out of sight. I cautiously stepped toward the source of the sound. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get the hell out of there. But curiosity had me in its grip. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I moved further down the aisle, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over at the end of the aisle where the figure had been on the monitor, nothing. Just empty shelves stacked with televisions and gaming consoles. I let out a shaky breath, chalking it up to my nerves. Maybe it was just the silence getting to me. The feeling of being alone in a place that was usually bustling with people. I turned to head back toward the electronics counter. That's when I saw it. A dark shape darted past the aisle entrance, just at the corner of my vision. My heart skipped a beat and I spun around, my pulse racing. No one was there. But I could feel it, someone was there, just out of my line of sight, lurking. I walked cautiously toward the aisle entrance, peering around the corner. The store felt even colder now, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. My breath came in shallow bursts and I had to force myself not to bolt out of there. I was alone, but something told me I wasn't alone. I called out, my voice shaky, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The store seemed to swallow the sound of my voice, leaving nothing but the echo of my words bouncing off the empty walls. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. The overhead fluorescent bulbs hummed, stuttered, and then went out completely. Darkness enveloped me, except for the faint glow of the emergency exit signs that illuminated the back of the store. My heart raced as I stood there, trying to adjust to the darkness. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the aisles, as if someone was walking toward me. someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I backed up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. I was paralyzed, trapped in the silence. I could feel the presence now, right behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a voice, soft, whispering, almost breathless, came from the shadows. "You're not supposed to be here," the words echoed in my mind, the voice still lingering in the shadows behind me. My skin prickled with the chilling sensation of being watched, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. What if I saw something I wasn't supposed to see? What if it was already too late? For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, silent, heavy, like the air had thickened around me. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel the presence, like something was breathing down my neck. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves, my mind racing with possibilities. I knew I needed to act. I couldn't just stand there frozen in fear. I had to get to the front of the store, get to the exit, and leave this nightmare behind. But my legs felt like lead and my body refused to obey. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, the faint glow of the exit signs feeling miles away. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever was lurking in the aisle. And then I saw it. A shape, tall and impossibly thin, standing motionless at the end of the aisle. It was like the figure from earlier on the security monitor. But now it was no longer just a shadow. It was real. The hoodie it wore was tattered and worn, but it hung at odd angles, as if the figure itself didn't quite belong to this world. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. And that voice, the whisper, came again. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were clearer now, like the figure was speaking directly into my ear, even though it was still standing at the far end of the aisle. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, every beat echoing in my skull. I forced myself to take a step back, but my foot caught on something, a discarded box on the floor. I stumbled, barely managing to catch myself against the shelf. The loud noise of the crash seemed to snap me out of my trance, and suddenly my legs were moving again. I bolted, running toward the nearest aisle, praying that I could find a way out of this nightmare. The dim emergency lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows along the shelves as I passed them. I couldn't tell if the figure was following me or if I was just imagining the footsteps that seemed to echo in the distance, but every instinct in me screamed to keep running. As I reached the front of the store, the automatic doors didn't open. They were malfunctioning, just like the cameras. My panic soared. I pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was still somewhere back in the store, maybe closer now. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pounded on the glass, trying to force the door open. But it was useless. I turned back, knowing the only way out was through the store, and that meant facing whatever was waiting for me in the dark. Then I saw it, just behind me in the reflection of the glass door. The figure. Its face was now visible, though only partially. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids, like dark pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. The face was stretched, as if it were too big for its head, and its mouth was twisted in a grin, but it wasn't human. It was something else, something older, and it was getting closer. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The reflection in the glass, the figure that had been standing just a few feet behind me, was now so close I could feel its presence, pressing in on me like a suffocating weight. The empty black voids of its eyes were locked onto mine, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat shaking my body. I slowly turned around, my movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if I were being controlled by some unseen force. There was no sign of the figure in front of me, but I knew it was there. I could hear its breathing now, slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the fear that radiated from me. The lights above me flickered again, and for a split second, everything went pitch black. Then, just as suddenly, the emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a dim, sickly glow. My eyes scanned the aisles, but all I could see was the faint outline of the shelves stacked high with merchandise, the shadows stretching long and distorted. I wasn't alone. A whisper, a cold, malevolent hiss came from the darkness. "You can't hide." I spun around, but the aisle behind me was empty. Nothing but empty shelves and the hum of the broken lights. My pulse raced, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to get out. I had to find an exit, a way to escape. The thought of being trapped here with that thing, whatever it was, made my stomach twist in dread. I moved quickly, darting between the aisles, my footsteps echoing through the store. Every creak of the floor, every rattle of a shelf made my heart leap in fear. I was sure it was right behind me, following me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then I heard it again. The soft, deliberate tapping sound. Closer now? It was unmistakable. The sound of something or someone slowly walking toward me, each tap like a countdown, a reminder that the figure was closing in. I turned a corner, hoping to lose it, but the moment I did, I saw it. The thing. It was standing at the end of the aisle, just like before. Its head tilted unnaturally, like it was studying me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I didn't think. I just ran. I darted down the aisles, my mind racing with panic. The store was a labyrinth, each turn leading me deeper into the maze of shelves. But no matter how fast I moved, I could still feel the thing behind me, growing closer with every step. It wasn't just following me. It was hunting me. I could feel it in the air, the tension, the weight of its presence. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if the store itself had come alive, as if every shelf, every wall was closing in on me. There was no escape, no way out. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again, and everything went dark. In that moment of total darkness, I heard something I hadn't expected. Laughter. It was low, guttural, and filled with a sick, twisted amusement. I spun around in the darkness, my breath catching in my throat. The laughter was coming from everywhere, echoing in the void. And then the lights came back on. But the figure wasn't in front of me anymore. It was standing behind me, so close I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze, unable to move. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke. "Got you." The words echoed in my ears, and every muscle in my body tensed, ready to spring into action. But I couldn't move. The figure was so close now, I could feel its presence like a shadow pressing against my skin. Its cold, hollow breath tickled the back of my neck, and a shiver ran down my spine. I forced myself to turn around, expecting to see the twisted, grinning face of whatever nightmare had been stalking me through the aisles. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just empty space. The shelves, the dark aisles stretching endlessly in front of me, and the dim, flickering lights overhead. It was gone. I stood there, my breath ragged, the fear gnawing at my insides. What the hell was happening? I couldn't make sense of it. The store felt wrong, so wrong, like it wasn't even a Walmart anymore. It was a place where the rules of the world didn't apply, a place where something ancient and malevolent had taken root. I ran again, moving faster this time, desperate to find an exit. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before whatever that thing was found me again. But the store, the aisles, they all looked the same. No matter which direction I ran, everything felt like it was looping, pulling me back toward the same place. I turned a corner and stumbled into a dark, narrow hallway that I hadn't noticed before. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't part of the regular store layout. The walls were bare, the floor covered in grime, and the smell of something rotten filled the air. This part of the store felt old, forgotten, a place that hadn't been touched in years. I took a hesitant step forward, my footfall echoing eerily in the stillness. The hallway stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness. But then I heard it. The tapping sound. Soft, almost distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I stopped, heart hammering in my chest, and listened. The sound was coming from the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't the same rhythmic tapping I'd heard before. It was different, chaotic, erratic, like someone was running toward me. I turned to run, but as I did, I felt something grab my arm. A cold, vice-like grip that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I spun around, expecting to see the figure. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. There were more of them. Figures. Tall, thin shapes, all cloaked in ragged, torn clothing. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but I could see their eyes, empty, black voids, like holes where a soul should have been. They were all staring at me, unmoving, silent. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling me deeper into the dark hallway. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the place. The figures moved closer, surrounding me. The air was thick with their presence, and I could hear their breathing, deep, slow, deliberate, filling my ears. One of them stepped forward, and in that moment, I thought I saw its mouth twist into a smile, stretching unnaturally wide. And then it spoke, its voice cold and hollow. "You should never have come back." And suddenly, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was absolute. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. making it impossible to escape. My body felt heavy, as if I had been lying there for hours, maybe even days, but everything around me was strange, unfamiliar. I was lying on the cold, concrete floor of what looked like a storage room. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of merchandise, they were filled with old, dusty boxes, crates, and odd, broken-down pieces of equipment. There were no lights, only the faintest glow coming from somewhere in the distance. The air smelled musty and stale, and the floor was damp beneath me. I tried to move, but my limbs felt weak as if I hadn't moved in ages. I looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of where I was. This wasn't the Walmart I knew. This place felt like a forgotten section of the store, something that had been sealed off long ago, left to decay in the dark. And then I remembered. The figures. The voices. The laughter. The thing that had been hunting me. Panic flooded through me as I struggled to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my side, forcing me to stop. It was then that I noticed something else. My clothes were torn as if I had been dragged through rough terrain. My skin felt bruised, scraped, like I had been through some kind of brutal struggle. I took a slow, shallow breath and looked around, my heart racing. There was no sign of the figures, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The silence was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood up carefully, my legs unsteady, and staggered toward the dim light in the distance. The air seemed to grow colder with each step I took, the darkness pressing in on me like it was alive, suffocating. The further I walked, the more the shadows seemed to stretch and warp, shifting in unnatural ways. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was a door. It was old, rusted, with peeling paint, but there was a faint light coming from underneath it, flickering like a distant hope. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to escape whatever hell I had found myself in. But just as I reached for the door handle, I heard the tapping again. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, closer. It was the same rhythmic tapping that I had heard before, but now it was frantic, almost angry. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, I saw them, more figures, standing in the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I froze. They were closer now, closer than I had ever seen them before. I could hear their breath, slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the fear in my veins. And then, in unison, they spoke, their voices cold and empty, like the wind howling through an abandoned house. "You shouldn't have tried to leave." I yanked the door open and ran, my feet pounding against the concrete floor. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from them, from whatever was behind me. But the door slammed shut behind me with an ear-piercing crash. I turned back in terror. The door was gone. Just an empty wall, cold and smooth, as if the door had never existed at all. And then I heard the whisper. "You're never leaving." I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened and the walls seemed to close in on me as I stumbled backward. The hallway I had just come from was now gone, swallowed by the darkness. The door that had been my only hope was now nothing but a smooth, empty wall. Panic set in and my mind raced, but there was no way out. No way to escape. I pressed my back against the cold wall, desperate to make sense of everything. The figures, their voices, the distorted store. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But the pain in my body, the bruises, the cuts told me it wasn't just in my head. This was real. I turned to face the direction I thought I had come from. There was no turning back. The figures were still out there, and I could feel their presence closing in. I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I took a step, then another. Each footfall seemed to echo through the emptiness, louder than the last. The cold air wrapped itself around me, seeping into my bones, and the walls felt like they were pressing closer with every breath I took. Then I saw it. A faint glow far down the hall. It flickered like a dying flame, but it was enough to keep me moving. I didn't care what it was. I didn't care if it was another trap. I had to go toward it. As I walked, I tried to keep my mind focused. The voices, the whispers, the tapping. They all felt like they were pulling at my mind, trying to break me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to think clearly, to ignore the growing fear that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. But then, just as I neared the light, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, each one louder than the last. I spun around, expecting to see one of the figures, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. The tapping, however, was getting closer. It was like something was dragging itself across the floor, getting closer with every heartbeat. I backed away, my breath ragged and quick, but it was no use. The footsteps were right behind me now. I turned around again and rushed toward the light, pushing my legs as fast as they would go. But the closer I got, the more the light seemed to flicker. And when I finally reached it, I saw something that stopped me cold. The light was coming from an old, cracked television screen, sitting in the middle of a room. The static buzzed loudly, the distorted image on the screen shifting rapidly between black and white. There was no source for the light, just the screen, flickering wildly, like it was trying to show something that was never meant to be seen. I stared at it, transfixed, as if something deep inside me was drawn to it. The static hissed louder, and for a split second, the image on the screen shifted. There was a face, a familiar face, my face. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I staggered back, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the face on the screen wasn't right. It was distorted, like a warped reflection, and its eyes were hollow, just like the figures in the store. And it was smiling, that grin, the one I had seen on those figures, stretching unnaturally wide, pulling the skin of the face into something grotesque. And then the face in the screen spoke. "You can't escape. You're part of this now." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating like a warning. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I felt something stir in the darkness behind me. I whipped around, but it was too late. They were there, the figures all around me moving closer. Their faces were nothing but black voids, but their presence filled the room, the store, everything. The hallway, the walls, the entire space felt like it was folding in on itself, trapping me in this nightmare. One of them reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against my shoulder, sending a shock of ice through my body. "You're ours," it whispered. The room, the walls, everything began to warp. The floor tilted, the shelves distorted into twisted shapes. It felt as though the entire world around me was being torn apart, sucked into the darkness. And then the last thing I heard before the world faded into blackness was the laughter. Cold, low, inescapable. When I woke up, I was back at the front of the store. The automatic doors were wide open, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering gently, just as they had when the night shift began. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I had never left. But the sick, gnawing feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I looked around, expecting to see the empty aisles, the dimly lit electronics section, but everything was normal. Too normal. The air didn't carry the same heaviness I had felt earlier. No flickering lights, no static hum of malfunctioning cameras. It was as though the nightmare I'd experienced had never existed. But I knew it had. I could still feel the coldness in my bones, the terror that had consumed me. I could still hear the faint echoes of the figures' whispers, their laughter, the feeling that I was being hunted. And when I turned back to the doors, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doors weren't open. I was standing in front of them, but they were now locked, the glass smooth and impenetrable. The store had gone silent again. The same silence, the same suffocating stillness that had enveloped me before. I looked down at the floor, my hands shaking. There was nothing. No sign of the hallway. No sign of the twisted, forgotten section of the store. No trace of the figures. But I could feel them. I could feel them all around me. The moment the thought crossed my mind, the temperature in the store dropped and the air grew thick with that same oppressive weight. I could hear their footsteps now, the slow, deliberate tapping that had followed me from aisle to aisle. I tried to move, but my legs were heavy like they were made of lead. The tapping grew louder, closer. Then, one by one, the figures began to appear, stepping out of the shadows in the aisles. They emerged from between the shelves, their twisted, faceless forms staring at me with those empty, black eyes. And then they began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by a force I couldn't comprehend. I was trapped in the store, trapped in the nightmare, with no way to escape. One of them reached out, a bony hand extending toward me, its long fingers curling like claws. Its voice, low and cold, echoed through the still air. "You'll never leave." It spoke with a certainty that sent chills down my spine. I tried to back away, but the figures were closing in from every direction. There was no way out, no way to escape the nightmare that had consumed me. And then, I heard the whisper again, soft and chilling, like a breath against my ear. "You're one of us now." The world around me began to distort once more. The walls of the store warped. The shelves twisted into impossible shapes. The floor buckled beneath me, and everything began to spin. I tried to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The entire reality around me unraveled. And then, just as I thought I was going to be swallowed by the darkness, the lights went out completely. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure where I was. The store was gone. The shelves, the lights, the sound of the buzzing fluorescent bulbs. They had all vanished. In their place was an endless, dark void, stretching out in all directions. I couldn't even tell which way was up or down. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating, and the silence was so deep it felt like it was pressing in on me, suffocating every thought, every breath. I reached out, my hands trembling, but there was nothing there. No walls, no floor, no way to orient myself. Just blackness. The same endless blackness that had consumed me before. The same place I had tried to escape. The same void. But something was different. This time I could feel something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. My heart raced, but my limbs were frozen like they didn't belong to me anymore. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever was in the dark with me, but there was nowhere to run. I was trapped. And then I heard it. The tapping. At first, it was soft, just a faint, rhythmic noise that I could barely hear. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming closer, just like it had in the store. The sound of feet dragging across the cold floor, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was closing in on me. I spun around, but there was no one. No figures, no shapes in the darkness. Just that incessant tapping. And then it stopped. The silence returned deeper than before. But this time it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the silence itself had become something tangible, something that pressed against my skin, filling my lungs, suffocating me. I could feel it creeping into my mind, pushing aside my thoughts, making everything blurry and distant. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But when I opened them again, I wasn't alone. They were standing in front of me, just as they had been in the store. The figures, the same faceless creatures, their bodies tall and thin, their clothes torn and tattered. But now something was different. Their eyes were no longer just empty voids. They were filled with something else, something alive. The darkness within them seemed to shift, like it was breathing, writhing. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But there was nowhere to go. No walls to run to, no door to escape through. I was in the center of their circle, surrounded by the very thing I had feared. The figures closed in, their faces blank, but somehow, I knew they were looking directly at me. They didn't need eyes to see. They could feel me. They could sense me. One of them reached out, its bony hand coming toward me. I tried to move, but my feet were glued to the ground. The figure's hand brushed against my skin, and I felt an icy shock shoot through me like the touch of death itself. I gasped, the coldness seeping into my bones, numbing me from the inside out. And then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers, it spoke. "You are one of us." The words rang in my mind like a bell, the sound vibrating in the emptiness, reverberating with something ancient, something wrong. The other figures stepped closer, their hands now reaching toward me, their fingers curling, tightening around my limbs, pulling me into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to fight, to push them away, but it was as if my body had stopped responding. The darkness pressed in, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its endless abyss. And as I was consumed by the darkness, I realized the terrifying truth. There was no escape. I thought I was gone. I thought I had been swallowed whole by the dark void, consumed by whatever twisted reality these figures had created. The crushing coldness, the unrelenting silence, everything was pulling me under. But then something changed. I felt the pull in my chest, like a tether that had snapped. A sharp, sudden jerk as though I was being yanked back from the edge of the abyss. The figure's hands, which had been closing in on me, suddenly released their grip and I fell plummeting into something soft, something warm. My body hit the ground with a dull thud and I gasped for air, sucking in deep breaths like I hadn't been able to breathe in an eternity. My chest burned, my limbs ached, but I was no longer in the dark. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sharp light. I wasn't sure where I was, but it wasn't that cold, suffocating void. I was lying on a floor, warm and solid, the air around me thick with the smell of something familiar, wood and dust. A room, an old, abandoned room. I pushed myself up, the remnants of the darkness still clouding my vision. But as I looked around, I realized I wasn't alone. The room I was in was small, dimly lit by the flickering glow of an old light bulb overhead. The walls were cracked, the floors covered in dust, but it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the people. They were sitting, hunched over, in the far corners of the room, their faces shadowed and obscured by their long, matted hair. Their bodies were still, unmoving, and at first, I thought they were nothing more than statues. But as I looked closer, I saw their eyes. Hollow, black eyes, just like the figures. They were watching me. Silent. Unblinking. A wave of horror washed over me, and I stumbled to my feet, backing away. But as I did, I heard a voice. Soft at first, like a whisper in the corner of my mind. You shouldn't have come here. I froze. It was one of them. One of the figures. But this voice was different. It wasn't one of the ones that had stalked me through the store. This voice was familiar. I looked toward the source, my blood running cold when I saw her standing in the center of the room. She was tall, her body gaunt like the others, but her face was different. I could see her eyes, clear and wide, but they were empty of emotion, of life. They were just dark. And as she stepped forward, her lips parted, revealing the same grotesque, hollow grin I had seen on the others. You've joined us now, she said. Her voice was cold, but there was something more chilling in the way she spoke. A sense of finality. I backed away, my hands shaking. No, I don't belong here. The woman raised a hand, silencing me. You can't leave. No one leaves. And that's when it hit me. The store, the figures, the darkness, it wasn't just a nightmare. This was the end. This was where they trapped people, where they kept them. I was one of them now. I had become part of the darkness, part of whatever twisted thing the figures were. As I stood there, paralyzed by the realization, I heard the familiar sound of the tapping once more. It was coming from all around me now, the figures moving, shifting, surrounding me. You're here forever, the woman whispered. The others began to rise, their bodies jerking into unnatural positions. One by one, they stepped toward me, their black eyes fixated on mine, their cold, bony hands reaching out. I had no strength left to resist. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. All I could hear was the relentless tapping, growing louder, until it became deafening. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see what was coming next, but it was already too late. I wasn't sure when it happened. Whether it was the moment the figures touched me, or when the woman's cold fingers brushed against my skin, but something inside me snapped. The weight of their presence pressed down on me, and I could feel myself slipping away. It was as if the very essence of who I was being torn apart, dissolved into the darkness that surrounded me. I tried to fight it. I tried to hold onto the fragments of my own identity, but it was impossible. The figures moved around me in a blur, their hollow eyes never leaving me, their hands reaching for me, dragging me deeper into the void. I felt a sharp pain, like my body was being stretched in every direction. My mind pulled into a place it was never meant to go. Time lost meaning. I couldn't tell if I was there for hours or days. Everything became distorted, like a nightmare that refused to end. I was becoming like them, just another lost soul, trapped in the darkness, unable to break free. And then, a voice, soft, like a whisper on the wind, but somehow clearer than anything else in the void. You'll watch. It wasn't the woman's voice. It wasn't one of the figures, either. This voice came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. It was a voice that resonated through my very bones, as if it were speaking directly to my soul. I turned, or at least I tried to, but I couldn't move. It was like my body had been shackled, trapped in place, completely under their control. I looked up, my vision blurry, and I saw her again. The woman, standing in front of me, her face twisting into a grotesque grin. You will never leave this place, she said, her voice hollow and distant. But you will watch. You will watch as we take others, and you will feel their fear, their pain, forever. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for mercy, but there were no words. There was only the tapping, the sound of the other souls, the ones who had come before me, moving around the room, shuffling in place like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The woman stepped back, her eyes never leaving me. The figures gathered around her, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways. They began to chant, a low, guttural sound that filled the room, vibrating through my skull. The darkness around us thickened, coiling like a living thing, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, as if by command, the figures began to move again, spreading out into the void, each one stepping toward a new victim. Their long fingers reached out, touching the souls that had yet to be consumed, pulling them into the fold, into the darkness. I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop watching. The whispers, the laughter, it all swirled around me, filling my mind, drowning me in a sea of fear and despair. And that's when it hit me. I was no longer just a victim. I was no longer just trapped in this nightmare. I was the watcher. I had thought I'd understood the horrors of that place. I had thought I knew what it meant to be trapped in the dark, to be haunted by those figures with their hollow eyes. But as I stood there, frozen in the heart of the darkness, I realized the truth in its most agonizing form. This was not just a prison for the living. This was a place of eternity, a place where souls did not simply disappear, but were bound to it, forced to witness the endless cycle of torment. The figures, the woman, the others, they were not just predators. They were the keepers of this place, the gatekeepers of something far worse than I had imagined. The tapping continued, the rhythmic sound echoing like a heartbeat in the dark. I turned my head slightly, my eyes no longer able to distinguish what was real and what was not. The shadows stretched endlessly, and I could hear the whispers of the lost souls, the ones who had come before me, around me, but they weren't speaking to me. They were speaking to each other, sharing their pain, sharing their fear. There was no end to it, no reprieve. The same distorted figures, the same cold grins, the same hollow eyes. It didn't matter how many souls entered this place. Each one added to the endless loop. Each one would feel the same fear, the same despair, the same loss, but none of us would ever be free. I turned back to the woman, the one who had condemned me to this fate. Her smile had faded, but her eyes still gleamed with something worse than malice, something ancient, something that could never be quenched. "You will never be alone," she said softly, her voice cold but certain. "You will watch them just as they watch you. Every soul that enters this place is yours to witness. You will see them fall, and in turn, they will see you. You will see everything." A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but from a deeper, more insidious feeling. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was now part of this place. I was a prisoner, yes, but I was also a witness, trapped, forever bound to watch as others were brought in, as they too became part of the endless cycle. I had been chosen not just to suffer, but to bear witness to the horror that unfolded forever. And as the figures began to move again, I felt the weight of that truth crush me. Each step they took, each soul they captured, each face that looked out in fear, I knew now I would see it all. Forever. The tapping never stopped. The whispers never ceased. It was as if time no longer mattered, there was no before and no after. There was only now, and it was endless. The worst part? I could already feel the beginning of the cycle again. The figures were leaving, pulling another soul into the fold, one more lost to the darkness, one more victim added to the endless parade. And I could feel the terror of the new soul, their confusion, their desperate attempts to escape. But I could do nothing. None of us could. I took my place among the shadows, knowing full well that I would never truly be alone again. The darkness would always be there, as with the whispers, the tapping, and the figures. And I would watch. I would always watch. As time dragged on in the suffocating void, something began to change within me. The darkness, once so foreign and terrifying, began to feel more familiar. The figures no longer seemed like distant horrors. I began to understand them, understand the twisted reality that kept us all trapped here. The moments of intense fear faded, replaced by something else. I felt detached, as if the horrors that had once overwhelmed me no longer had the same power over me. I had watched countless souls enter this place, witnessed their confusion and terror, their futile attempts to escape. The first few had been unbearable. I had fought against the overwhelming sense of despair that threatened to drown me. But now the sorrow felt distant. I had come to accept the inevitability of it all. I had become this place. I would never escape. I would never be free. But the truth was, I didn't care anymore. I had lost myself in the endless cycle, my mind slowly warping to fit the pattern of the figures, of the dark void, of the endless whispers. There was nothing left of the person I once was. There was only the eternal watch, the endless repetition of the cycle. In the deep corners of my mind, I began to understand something chilling. I was not merely witnessing the fate of others. I had become one of the watchers, one of the entities that governed the darkness. I wasn't just trapped among them. I was part of them. It was a horrifying thought, but in a strange way it was also liberating. The sense of self that I had once clung to began to melt away. The fear, the desperation, those feelings became distant memories. I was something else now, something much older. My senses dulled. I stopped recognizing faces. I stopped trying to understand who had entered the void and who had been here for centuries, cycling through the same endless dance. And yet, there was a part of me that still clung to the memory of what I had been. It was faint, like a shadow that lingered even in the deepest darkness. But it was there, somewhere beneath the layers of this new existence. I remembered the fear. I remembered the shock of the first soul, my own, that had fallen into the trap. I remembered the scream that had reverberated through the airless void when I realized that there would be no escape. And yet, now I was one of them, watching, waiting, as the next soul was dragged in. I felt the shift in myself before the new soul even arrived. The tapping began again, soft at first, then building louder and louder. A new presence, a fresh soul, just as helpless and confused as I had been. But this time I didn't feel fear. I only felt curiosity. The last vestiges of the person I used to be began to slip away, replaced by something much darker, much older. And as the new soul stepped into the fold, I was there watching. I could see the panic in their eyes, the realization that they would never leave. They would join the cycle just like the rest of us. And I would be there, part of the crowd, part of the figures that gathered, that waited, that watched. I had become just like them. And in the end, that was the only fate that awaited us all. As the cycle continued, something new began to stir within me. The sense of acceptance I had once felt of being one with the darkness was no longer enough. Something was missing. A new feeling bubbled to the surface, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. It was a sense of yearning, a desire for something beyond the endless repetition of shadows, whispers, and lost souls. I knew this feeling. I had felt it before. It was hope. It seemed absurd, like an echo from a time long past, but it was there nonetheless. A small, flickering light that refused to be extinguished despite the overwhelming darkness that surrounded me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to question, to wonder, was there a way out? Could there be something more to this existence than the eternal watch? Was this truly all there was? I glanced around at the figures, the other lost souls, who stood motionless in the void. They seemed oblivious to my inner turmoil, locked in the same repetitive trance, their black eyes staring blankly ahead. I knew they were part of the cycle, just as I had become. They were as much a part of the void as the shadows themselves. But I had once been different. I had once been human. I had once fought for survival, struggled for escape. Was it possible that the remnants of my humanity still lingered? Could I defy the eternal watch and find a way out? I began to push against the crushing weight of the void, resisting the pull of the figures, resisting the grip that had so firmly held me in place. It was hard, like trying to move through quicksand, but I felt something stirring within me. Something stronger than fear, stronger than the resignation that had taken over me for so long. There was a brief flicker of light, faint and distant, but I could feel it. It was a spark of something other than the never-ending darkness. My heart raced, and for the first time in ages, I felt something like fear, but it was not the same as the terror that had once paralyzed me. It was the fear of hope, of longing, of trying to break free from the cycle that had bound me for so long. I reached out toward the light, the spark of something that felt real. As I did, I felt the presence of the watchers, the figures, closing in. Their grip, their influence, was stronger than ever. But I was no longer as passive as I had once been. I was fighting, clawing, struggling for something more than this endless nightmare. But then, as my fingers brushed the light, I realized the truth. The spark was not an escape. It was a trap, a trick. The figures closed in around me, their eyes empty, but I felt their gaze pierce through me. Their whispers echoed louder, and their voices merged into one, deep and ancient. "You cannot escape," they hissed in unison. "You are the first watcher, the one who was chosen to see it all. There is no end to this." I recoiled, the light flickering out of reach. The weight of their words hit me like a stone, and the crushing reality settled back in. I had thought I could fight it. I had thought I could resist. But I was wrong. I wasn't just part of the cycle. I was the beginning of it. The first watcher, born from the darkness, bound to it. The ones who had come before me, the figures that haunted the void, had always been there, and they had been watching me, waiting for me to realize my true role. I was created for this. I was not meant to escape. I was meant to watch. The void closed in around me, and I was no longer just a lost soul. I had become the thing I had feared. The realization hit me like a flood. I wasn't just another soul lost in the endless cycle. I wasn't just another victim trapped in the void. I was the beginning of something much darker. Something that had existed long before me and would continue to exist long after I was gone. I was the watcher, the first one, the one who had been chosen to witness it all. The truth was clear now. There was no escape from this place. There was no way out of the eternal void. I had been pulled into it, and I had become a part of it, a part of the darkness that would forever consume everything. My role was simple. I was to watch. The figures that surrounded me began to shift, their presence closing in. Their eyes, still hollow and black, turned toward me, and I realized they weren't just there to torment me. They had been waiting for me to understand. They had been waiting for me to accept my fate. I could hear their whispers again, growing louder with each passing moment. "You were always meant to be one of us," they said in unison, their voices blending into one deep, eerie hum. I tried to fight it, tried to push against the weight of the words, but it was useless. There was no resistance anymore. There was no escape from what I had become. The darkness wrapped around me, tightening its grip until I could no longer move. The tapping, the whispers, the endless cycle, it all became one, a single, unbroken sound that filled my mind, my soul, my very existence. And then I felt it. The sharp, cold edge of the void itself. It wasn't just a place. It was a being. A force. It had consumed me, and now it would consume everything. The cycle had no beginning. It had no end. It was eternal, and I would be a part of it forever. I was the watcher. And now I would watch as countless others fell into the same darkness. I would watch as they too became a part of the void. And I would feel their fear, their pain, their despair, just as I had. And when the next soul entered the fold, I would be there, waiting for them just as the figures had waited for me. This was the end of one life, but the beginning of a new eternity. And in the end, it was all the same. There was no escaping. There was no hope. Only the endless, eternal watch,